But there's something about Gurdjieff that where his teachings, and you've mentioned this before, they do feel Nietzschean, and like Nietzsche said, like I am dynamite, and he's someone who will rock your world, and yeah, there's this real sense of Gurdjieff having a quality of testing, or kind of like an energetic shaking up of the space, and that can feel difficult for a lot of people. Like it's a difficult path of sorts because it challenges you. And yeah, I'm just curious about, is that kind of your approach too? I really sense in you, you're a very big hearted person, and there's a kind of, maybe this is just, from the limited time I've noticed you, but the softness to you. So I'm curious about that, whether you feel like that harshness or harshness maybe isn't the right word, but yeah, what's your relationship to that kind of quality of the Slayer Man?
There's
the
definitely
rascality.
Yeah, Rascal Pascal. I gave a talk on the figure of the trickster teacher at this thing called Clown Virgins 2 days ago. And there's problems with that figure, right? Just the very idea of that figure almost lends itself to abuse in various ways. I think there's a natural way in which a spirituality that we experience, and not everybody's spiritual path is like this. Somebody's spirituality can be very generic, like you're just a generic human, and here's the generic knowledge, and then you make the generic transformation to the generic consciousness. I don't see Gurdjieff being like that. I see it more organic, right? That the idiosyncratic thing about you is being enabled to flourish, right? That it's a way of training your peculiarity to rise to its highest possible level. And I think where a teaching has a respect for individuality and peculiarity, and where it's, let's say, full spectrum, open on all of its chakras, open on all of its intelligence systems, and in which people who go through this kind of living develop a lot of energy and a lot of nuance, then it's extremely likely that the way they show up will be more tentacled, more complex. It'll fall outside of contexts in a way, not necessarily in a harsh way, like, hey, we've got to break the conventions here, because it's, I think, more natural, more responsive, and maybe it looks a little harder in one circumstance with one group of people and a little softer in another one. But by and large, it seems to me very natural, maybe a little bit elf-like, very benign, the way the grass and the trees and the birds and the lizards would try to teach you. So it's challenging, puts you up against ordeal and complexity. It asks you to participate in your own suffering and your own friction in certain ways, and to follow a growth life that has effort in it, that really is trying to change you and not just trying to accommodate you to the stillness of the background condition of the mind. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that to be a little bit challenging, and then you have to safeguard yourself against being too challenging, right? So you want to not confine yourself to the expectations and assumptions of the people you're dealing with, but you also want to let your respect for them and for the group consciousness and your love for them as individuals, and your resonance with the space be kind of the guide to what you're doing. And if the people who you like are saying, well, I think you're maybe going a little bit too far now, you're like, okay, on my own, maybe I would do that. Let's blow this all up. I'm going to dial that back, because there's some real people here I'm trying to talk to, and I'm not going to take all of their sensitivities and anticipations into consideration, but I am going to try to receive feedback and walk like a fluid middle line between chaos and traditional teaching.
Yeah, and this is part of our conversation in prep yesterday. Actually, it was around obviously Gurdjieff was a product of his times, and the amount of publicity. He was somewhat of a. I was saying he's equivalent of a public figure in the same way that maybe NSYNC and I are public figures. Like, we're barely known, but we're out there in some form. And I imagine Gurdjieff, it was rare perhaps for people to stumble upon him in terms of his his core fraternity, or his core kind of temple. So maybe there's a sense of like at that time there was more permission to be a bit more harsh, because it's like, well, I want my people, I want the community here to grow with, but come to my level. Like, I want peers. I don't want to like be holding everyone's hand or like trying to. Yeah, I'm curious about if you could speak more to
Well,
Gurdjieff's.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's also a sense in which that serves as a filter, right? Like a kind of a test, a trial by fire. You know what I mean? Like, if you are the kind of person who is cut out to be here, then you will flourish. But if not, then you'll leave. You know, and there's something about that that's very efficient. You know.
Right, and like you're saying, Layman, you don't need to have everyone. Not everyone's going to be attracted to this path.
There's a lot of issues here, right? On the one hand, there's I think if you're successful to some degree in your existential practice, you're kind of, it's like you're pregnant. There's this thing growing inside you, and as that thing hatches out, you don't exactly know what it's going to do, right? You can have all the values and strategies you want, but it might surprise you. And you might end up just trying to follow it or just trying to hold it back. And so there's this real living, like, if it's a wild horse, what are you going to do? You got to just let that wild horse do what it does. Then there's, like you were saying, there is a filtering aspect to it, right? I find I do that a little bit just with language, especially if you're in public spaces. If you say things that are either very confusing, very complex, or use charged language that people, Nietzsche would do this too, right? Nietzsche used deliberately charged language to make sure the people who were reading him were people who were ready to go past that charge and do the delicate work of separating symbols from reality. And if you're just like, wait, that symbol has a negative charge, well, we don't really want you here, right? It's not that you're bad, but you're not ready for this at the moment. That's not the kind of thing we're working on. I think Gurdjieff also has a particular background, right? And it's not like, in my view of spirituality, you don't become neutral bodhisattvas who all have the same personality characteristics. The neurogenetic and historical person that you are is always the communication tool. And no matter how far you go down the process, that's the language you speak, the language of your structure. His structure was, a patriarchal Greco-Armenian culture in the 19th century, right? So as much as he lived with weird lesbian avant-garde artists in Paris in the 1920s and all this kind of stuff, he still had a huge amount of his formative experience in these really old school patriarchal systems where a bearded guy yells at you to do more, be harder, that kind of stuff. So some of it was just his flavor. Some of it was his need to really put pressure on people who weren't just developing on their own, but developing in a way that he thought was necessary to his general work, right? So some of what he's doing is to try to help other people grow, and some of what he's doing is he thinks he has a project, right? And he really needs certain kinds of helpers, and he needs them soon, and they have to have not just understanding, but a certain kind of rigor, a certain kind of strength. So then beyond all of that stuff, as like a more general principle, you need to be challenged, and your teacher needs to help you suffer in the right way. And that's dependent upon how nuanced he is in seeing where you're at, how nuanced he is in helping you suffer, on how prepared you are to suffer productively rather than badly, and how much he can tell the difference between his inspired attempts to help you suffer and just the normal dickishness of being a human being who wants to meddle in other people's minds sometimes.
Yeah, always hard.
I love that you said that, honestly, because like one of the things actually that is an interesting synchronicity for me, and one of the things that Alexandra and I were discussing is, this notion of like someone who is a bit of a character, who has that kind of challenging way about them, but that you can also feel, first of all, that there's something about them, like this person's been changed by their efforts, and also this person is trying to help. This person is like this rascality is directed towards helping me to see my own folly, sort of thing, to know myself better, kind of thing. But yeah, there's actually what my ex mentor who I worked with for a year had a lot of these qualities, and yeah, it's interesting, I think, to think about that recognition of, you know, yeah, here's someone who, the way I like to talk about it sometimes is this is someone who's guided, you know, this is someone who is walking a path and they've walked it a long way, and they have something to teach, you know what I mean? But at the same time, this is just a human being, you know what I mean? And there is sometimes, even for that person, there is a blurring of the lines between I'm trying to help and fuck you, you little shit, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the integral theory does a good job of modeling a lot of this, of saying, like, okay, there's multiple intelligences and you can be really good at these ones and not so good at these ones. And then you have to do shadow work in addition to that. So you can lay out a map that would be a really good framing device for people. But in practice, it seems to be a lot simpler than that, which is, you just have to be aware that as good as you are at anything and as inspired as you are, you can't always tell the difference between where you leave off and some function begins. So I don't know if you know Andrew Cohen, the famous spiritual teacher, died in the last couple of weeks. I've been doing some interviews with his students. He was very popular, ran a big magazine, had a big community in the 90s, and then there was a collapse of his community, and then a period of his wandering in the wilderness, and then he had a new community in India, and now he's passed on. But one of the things he told me was this sort of one third, one third, one third approach when he looked back. Because he was known as being a very, very tough teacher who put a lot of pressure on people to transcend themselves. And he thought about a third of the time that he was completely inspired in those moments. And it was a direct hit, and he was able to help his students do something that it would have taken them a very long time, if at all, for them to achieve in themselves. And then about another third of the time, he was inspired, basically correct, but maybe didn't get it quite right, and maybe helped them a little, maybe it was neutral, maybe destabilized them a bit. And then another third of the time, it was his own human impulses, just aggression and control and wanting to be right and wanting to be the teacher and thinking he knew better than you. And he couldn't tell that apart from those other two, right? And so that was his sense at the end of a long life of being an internationally prominent character doing this kind of thing. So to me, that's very illuminating, right? That's necessarily going to be the case in some way, no matter how much you've sacrificed your unit to a transcendental flow or a greater beingness or something. The unit's always going to have its tendencies. No one is ever humanly perfectly developed, and they have to at least be aware of that and be able to talk to the people around them about that. Because it's okay for it to be messy, and it's okay for you to make mistakes, and there will be turbulence. And if you're going to co-enact a spiritual thing with somebody, yeah, it can go wrong. It can not work. It can be a mess. It can cause chaos. All that stuff has to be understood. But you at least need a frame of epistemic humility where you say, yeah, I could be wrong. And let's talk about it.
Yeah, I love that. It feels like such a big journey that I've been on as well, of like trying to figure out, trying to pull apart, like when is it true intuition and when is it just my mind running away, or when is it just kind of like a habit or an impulse or whatever it is. And I love that framing of like, I probably will never get it 100%, right? Like there's never, and that probably is not even the goal. Like I want to get better at it. But yeah, I really like that. It's like remind myself that it's okay that I don't know, like most of the time probably, but still not to let that stop me from trying, right? Like I think that's the important part.
Yeah, that's the so metamodernism has this famous aesthetic of sincere irony, right? So the irony is a way of talking about modern and postmodern critical distance, of sort of being suspicious of everything. That the modernists were like, oh, all that nonsense everybody's been believing is just pre-rational group nonsense. And then the postmodernists were like, yes, and your modern shit is pre-rational nonsense as well, because where did you get your ideas of science and reason and progress, and what does the GDP actually mean, and are we even individuals, and all this kind of like super critical deconstruction of the basic structures of sense making, which allow you to be standoffish and jokey and critical. But what you get in a lot of postmodernism is a spiritual barrenness, right? You become a kind of a nullity. You just exist as your identity, and other people have to appreciate your identity. And you're never really involved in the world because you can't trust everything you've deconstructed. But the metamodern idea is, no, if you keep going, if you keep deconstructing and deconstruct even your deconstruction, then you return to a kind of sincere participation, a full emotional and physiological and social and virtue-oriented engagement in the world, but you don't lose any of that skepticism, criticism, irony, all that kind of thing. So you've got both of those. And to bring those together and to say, well, we don't really know, and in some ways we can't really know. We're never going to find information and knowledge about the world that's outside of our interpretive frames, right? It's not an old-fashioned thing where we go, yes, those are your beliefs, but there's really this thing. You go, well, that's kind of interpreted as well. You're like, okay, that's the situation. We're going to take that situation seriously. Everything is intercontextual. That doesn't mean we hold back, right? That's even the reason for full dynamic, transformational human engagement with the world as it comes at us. And bringing those two together is, I think, at the core of the metamodern ethic and especially of metamodern spirituality.
Yeah, really lovely. And definitely it seems like almost like a revival in a way of a kind of existentialist strain of thought that has been around for quite a long time. I wanted to, in that vein, I wanted to circle back around a little bit to Colin Wilson. He actually has a great book. I would call it an existentialist book called The Outsider. But I was curious, what texts did you read that by him that introduced you to Gurdjieff? And I mean, because interestingly, one of the strange parts of this synchronicity, this strange parallel between this conversation around Gurdjieff and my ex-mentor Mystic is I actually came into contact with Gurdjieff through Colin Wilson because Mystic recommended to me that I read Mysteries, which is the middle book of the Occult trilogy. And obviously Gurdjieff is one of the things that Colin Wilson talks about quite a bit in that trilogy. But I'm curious, what was your introduction to Colin Wilson's work?
Yeah, Colin Wilson, and there's a few people around who were really affected by Colin's work. And I think it's hard to get a good public appreciation of him because he wrote in so many genres that it's hard for normal thinking to take him seriously. But I think he's a really profound thinker and probably the first Western philosopher to try to think about how you actively produce peak experiences and what that would change for us as a species. The Occult and Beyond the Occult were probably the first two I read. Circled back to The Outsider. Read those novels about the giant spiders. His book about the history of crime and murder. Right, that's very interesting because you get this dark shadow side of peak experiences. Some of his novels. His like Lovecraftian novels. The names are like The Philosopher's Stone doesn't sound Lovecraftian, but the ancient entities that people see once their new faculties are enacted in themselves. That stuff was fascinating for me. And I've got a great audiobook compendium of him because this book came out a couple of years ago that just has samples of him from all throughout his work with a couple of new forewords. Beautiful audiobook collection.
Wow.
I sampled a lot.
I would love it if you could link me to that or something.
I will make a note.
Yeah. I'm curious as well.
Well, let me say a few more things about him because he is really, I mean, first of all, he's a great writer for a young man because it's about focus and it's about sex and it's about transgression and it's about being like a special group of male social outsiders who are the secret higher people. So like that's all very attractive in an adolescent sense. But the thing I love most about him is his relentless fixation on how you use intentional attention to provoke changes in your energy state and consciousness, and that he will do that in any genre of book. right? If the publisher says, hey, people need an opera, he's got, great, here's my opera. People use intentional focus to induce peak experiences. Like, all right, a book about serial killers, great. Here's how serial killers use intentional focus to induce peak experiences. So he's relentless in putting this one message forward in a very open-ended way, saying, let's really explore the phenomenological mechanisms, and he's willing to do it in any style you put before him. I just find that delightful.
Yeah, no, he's a brilliant writer. I'm curious if you know, actually, I'd love to hear your opinion on it, but actually he published a more recent book called The War Against Sleep. It's like a revisiting of all of his work on Gurdjieff. I'm curious, if you've read that, what you think of it, if you have, and I guess also, like, maybe to just get us back into Gurdjieff a little bit, like, how would you relate to that framing of Gurdjieff as being about the robot and sleep? And because Colin Wilson is very heavy on that, which I understand he gets a lot from Ouspensky, but I really love that framing, and that framing has been very resonant for me. And I heard you talking a little bit in a couple of your videos about, I mean, you seem very conscious of the influence of translation and the role that interpretation plays in explaining someone else's ideas, and the role of your own ideas getting involved in that and getting mixed up. And yeah, so I guess I'm just trying to probe a little bit into that nexus.
Yeah, I mean, Colin Wilson is not generally well respected among Gurdjieffians. And I think that's two things. First of all, there's a ton of stuff he leaves out. Second of all, he's trying to make it his own, right? He really brings his own ideas into it. And that's what I respect about his work, right? The robot and the Laurel and Hardy theory of consciousness, and how efforts can break frames and cause you to use more energy. And the more energy you send to your consciousness, the more it gets psyched about that, and you get a little productive feedback loop going. I think that's a fantastic element of what Gurdjieff was saying. I think Wilson's framing is very often overly influenced by Ouspensky's, as so many of the framings are. And it's completely understandable why. And it's not problematic as long as we know about it, right? Lots of traditions are, especially traditions that call themselves the fourth way, are pretty well set up by the Ouspenskyan frame, such that even when they encounter Gurdjieff's own writing, they're always trying to figure out how it fits into what Ouspensky was saying. And that's not bad. Ouspensky is brilliant. But there are more tentacles than that, and a much more interesting mess, all centered around Gurdjieff's own deliberately strange thicket of writings. And then everybody's different interpretive takes. And then when you get involved, you're obviously going to have your own interpretive take. And you do your work to keep growing past that and challenging it. But it's also the very thing that's going to steer you through this, because as far as I read Gurdjieff, he's asking you to develop something unique about yourself, right? And when he puts out Beelzebub's Tales, yes, it's a great critique of the life of man, and yes, it's communicated to the subconscious, and yes, it has all the pieces of his teachings scattered through that in a very interesting way. But it's also a weird imaginal universe. It's a tremendous science fiction landscape. And it's not like you're supposed to take on board this idea that super intelligent ravens live on Mars and are studying the fundamental nature of a transpolar life energy that governs the cosmos, right? But what I think he's asking you to do is develop your own nonsense to that level of sophistication.
Wow, I love that so much. Yeah, I'm trying to write a novel that embodies a lot of my thinking, and it's a challenge. But the freedom there in what you described is kind of the not like bringing more nonsense to it, like making it too serious. Like I love satire, and I love bringing humor to this kind of work. But yeah, bringing something, the sci-fi genre, and especially gives a lot of permission for that.
It's a balance, right? You have to constantly task yourself to be more disciplined, be more robust, not just be playing with ideas, but at the same time, you have to feel completely free to play with ideas.
Mm-hmm. almost feels like the practice, right? Like we talk about the work of helping heal the robot or whatever, coming out of sleep. It feels like it's we need the sort of I don't know, there's a seriousness to it and a play to it, right? Like we need the play is sort of the balm, and the seriousness is kind of a focus, and yeah, there's something really important about that.
Well, another thing I think, and I think play is a really important word for this reason, but play is one of those very primitive notions that is a nexus of meanings. And so one of the senses of play is latitude, right? Is the capacity to innovate, to be organic, to be spontaneous. That's one sense of play, which I really love, because that's a big part, I think, of the importance of play in, I think, being serious about the world, is the willingness to come up with something totally audacious and then go, hold on a minute, but what if though? You know, like, let's imagine what the world would look like if we took this to be true. Like, what would that be, and how could that maybe help us to live, and what possibilities might that unlock for us if we imagined that this was true?
Yeah, that brings up two things for me. One is the role of child practice, right? So there's an emphasis in Gurdjieff, more so than in a lot of contemporary spiritual teachings, about how do you mature as an actual human being, right? Or it's not like, well, should I be a Buddhist or a Muslim? You know, like, can you be a Buddhist or a Muslim? Like, are you even a person yet? Like, let's get you some basic functional human capacities first. So there's this real focus on adulting in Gurdjieff, but there's also a thing about children where they are the fastest developers we know, right? They go through huge stages of maturation at a rate far in excess of the adults. And partly because it's built in, and partly because society backs them up on that. But one of the things we don't really inspect very often is, what are they doing as exercises? Are they doing some form of the work, right? And you see them experimenting with negative sensations. They might touch that hot thing. They might eat that sour candy. They might smell that disgusting thing. They're also involved in some form of making up arbitrary rules for themselves that they have to carry out tasks around, right? Like, oh, we can't step on the cracks on the pavement. You're like, okay, that's an unnecessary intention-driven consciousness practice. And maybe a lot of what we're calling play is actually a reasonably simplified natural version of intentional suffering and conscious labor in the Gurdjieffian sense. So it's worth looking at the more playful elements of it. The other thing that I would bring in, and I always think it's really pertinent that Gurdjieff is living in Paris in the 1920s, because I grew up, I didn't mention this earlier, but I was deeply into the surrealist art movement. As a philosophy, I was reading the manifestos in high school and trying to do the kinds of practices they were doing, because I really believed, in kind of a shamanic instinctual way, that there was another form of awareness you got by merging consciousness and unconsciousness. Right, that there was some like hybrid version of the subconscious that you could bring forward by merging what we might now call the two hemispheres of the brain or something like that. And you need a tremendous amount of imaginative play to merge with your reasonable understanding and perceptions in order to catalyze a kind of supermind of some kind. And Gurdjieff talks very explicitly about how what we call the subconscious is what he calls the real conscious mind. And then he gives us a fantastic, an imaginal universe worthy of a Salvador Dali painting, right? There's a real imaginative freedom and play in what he puts forward there. So I think of the child aspect and the surrealism aspect as essential to the role of play in something like the work.
So I just had like a moment there, just like kind of absorbing all of this, because it feels like really resonant for a lot of what I'm working on at the moment.